gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Melissa Kort. Melissa has her BA from UCLA, and while she was doing that, she took a semester abroad, or a year abroad, was there a semester? A year at the University of Kent in Canterbury. She then did her MA at the University of Virginia, and recently, or fairly recently, it seems to me anyway, but probably it's 10 years ago, she got her PhD from the University of Spoiled Children, also known as UCSC, and the topic was Facing the Camera, Dickens Photography and the Anxiety of Representation. So Melissa's background has a very, very strong background in not only British literature generally, but specifically in Dickens. She has been at SRJC off and on since 1979, but that also includes time as an NEH scholar in North Carolina, a Fulbright exchange teacher in York, England, and semesters teaching for SRJC's London program abroad. She has published on subjects ranging from faculty development to children's tooth care. So, who knew? So today, I welcome Melissa, and I know that all of us have, we might say, great expectations for this wonderful lecture coming our way. Melissa.
Thank you. Bob and I are celebrating 30 years of being here at SRJC together, so we've known each other a long time. I want to make an apology to start with because I thought there'd be a screen in front of me for me to see this. So every so often I'll have to turn and read this. I'm not trying to be rude. Also, those of you who came early enough and were listening to the music, I hope you made the connection between that music and Great Expectations. That is the music of Handel's Harmonious Blacksmith, which if you remember, that's how Herbert Pocket gives Pip the nickname Handel because the only blacksmith that Herbert has ever known about was from this piece of music, the Harmonious Blacksmith. So there's a Dickens connection to everything. Also, the picture here of the Norton Critical Edition of Great Expectations, that's the one that the page numbers are for the whole for all of the slides. And that's the man himself, called himself the Inimitable. And we'll talk about Dickens in photographs as I go along. The one thing I want to do before the lights totally blind me is how many people have finished reading the novel? Okay, so I won't be giving away anything for you. How many people, if you haven't finished the reading the novel, have at least read the first section of it? Good. And how many people have never read Dickens ever in their lives? All right, hi up there. Yes. Oh, sorry. Gooseneck. You're welcome. So I'm going to start. My theme today is really how to read Dickens. I'm the lecturer who, even though Dickens is my special field, I really want to make sure everybody's on target to read Dickens well. I think we assume we know how to read Dickens because it's English after all, but it's difficult, challenging to get used to reading Dickens differently. And I'm also trying to talk to those of you who want to read other novels beyond Dickens to think about strategies for successful novel reading in general. So I'm going to give you 4 simple rules for better novel reading. First one is watch out for aliens. I'm going to go into detail about this as I go along. Assume every word counts. Go to the movies in your head and connect the dots. So the first rule is watch out for aliens. And I get this metaphor of the aliens actually from Karen Joy Fowler, who came to talk here at SRJC a few years ago about Jane Austen. She's the author of the Jane Austen Book Club. And she said, I asked her a question. She had originally been a science fiction writer. And I asked her how she moved from writing science fiction to writing this novel about people who read Jane Austen. And she said she felt science fiction readers were the best readers around because when they opened a book, they always knew they were on an alien planet. And they would spend their time when they were initially getting accustomed to the book trying to figure out the rules and regulations of that alien place. So the first rule, watch out for aliens, is based on this idea that every novel creates a world of its own. and the concurrent idea that every novel, if it's worth reading, should be providing a map of how to negotiate that world. So if you think about the opening of Great Expectations, and I have here an illustration from the 1946 David Lean film of Great Expectations, of Pip in the graveyard, you think of that opening scene of Pip in the graveyard, much of what it is doing is trying to set out the map for how you're supposed to read the book. That is, you're supposed to read into the book. Rather than take it merely literally, you're supposed to figure out, use your imagination, engage in the book in the same way that Pip engages with the shape of the letters on his parents' tombstone to figure out what they look like. And I'm going to go into detail about that. If you look very carefully at the opening chapter, you actually get all the rules for how to negotiate the rest of the novel. The second part of this comes from a line, the past is a foreign country. I think a lot of students particularly get, I think the kind word would be to say flummoxed by reading Dickens because they don't recognize the place. I once had a student many years ago who said to me that he hadn't done the assigned reading, which at the time was Dickens's novel David Copperfield, because he said, it happened a long time ago, and besides, I never planned to go to London. I want you to think about going to a novel as an opportunity to, a novel like this, as an opportunity to visit the past. This is your entranceway. This is your tourist's visa. And it gives you an opportunity to enjoy being in the middle of the past, reading this like somebody in the past, at the same time that you can be somebody in the present. It's kind of when in Rome, do as the Romans do, except you're never really Italian. This is a student of mine. I'm going to focus on the beginning of the novel, though I'll be talking about some things that happen later as well. This is a line from a student of mine I don't see in the room, but so I don't have to give you her name. She wrote an online discussion that we're having in that class. It's English 46. She wrote, while I have enjoyed reading more of Great Expectations, I keep thinking about the first chapter. In the first few pages, the reader gets a slew of information. I learned so much about Pip and his awful upbringing, the poverty and the hunger of the time, and the class system. The chapter was also somewhat Gothic. It builds tension and fear, and most importantly, it builds sympathy and investment within the reader for Pip. I could spend an hour lecture just trying to get you through the first chapter. Actually, I could spend an hour lecture trying to get you through the first page because it's so complexly done, it's so heavily laden with meanings that it helps to set up that roadmap, take that first step into the foreign country by very slowly going through the opening chapter. But I'm going to try to be a little bit broader than that. I'm going to dip into a lot of the opening chapter and then try to get broader than that. So the first one, rule, watch out for aliens. The second rule, assume every word counts. And this is an image of Dickens's manuscript of Great Expectations. So for those of you who are still under the false assumption that you can write brilliantly without ever having to go back and correct yourself, even in the first few lines, there's Dickens writing and revising and revising and revising. I think that really shows all of us as writers to be humble before the page. Dickens very carefully chose his words. It's a myth to say that there's a lot of words in Dickens's novels because he was getting paid by the word. That's simply not true. There's a lot of words in Dickens's novels because he has very complex characterizations and very complex plots. And he was trying to sell his magazines, but he wasn't being paid by the word. Every word that's in there is going to pay off in some way. And so the more we can pay attention to specific words, the more we can get out of the novel. And this is true about any work of literary merit. I want to reinforce that. The novels that you read, my mother used to read doctor's novels. You know, it's like a story, same exact story all the time. The doctor fell in love, and the doctor almost lost the person's life, and the doctor saved the person's life, and same story every single time. I would not ask her to pay attention to every word. But when you're in the presence of a work of great literary merit, such as Great Expectations, paying attention to every word actually pays off in a big way. So the sentence I want to concentrate, my favorite sentence in the whole novel is this one. This is the very beginning of the novel. This is when Pip is looking at the tombstone. He says, "As I never saw my father or my mother, and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs. My first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. So the trick about paying attention to every word counts, is that you have to know what those words mean. All right, so the key words for me in this passage are the terms likeness, the days of photographs, fancies, and derived. So when I look them up, I find out that likeness means resemblance, similarity, image, outward appearance. The days of photographs, I'm going to get into in a minute. Just hold that thought. Fancies are the product of imagination. It's kind of an old-fashioned word to talk about imagination. It's the feelings of desire or liking, conceptions, fantasies. And derived means obtain something from, to induce or deduce from facts. And I find this paragraph, this sentence gives a set of contradictory ideas. First of all, Dickens is making sure that we know that the world of Pip is before the world of photographs. Certainly the world of Pip's childhood is before the days of photographs. Why is that important? Because photography posits a certain way of seeing where you get exact reproduction in a photograph. And the fear at the time was that if we can photograph the world, why should we paint it? Why should we write novels about it? How can we accomplish anything more realistic than the photograph? So this is what in my dissertation I call the anxiety of representation. There was a fear that with this mechanical ability to reproduce the world, that all of the imaginative reproductions of the world in art were going to become useless. And Dickens sets this novel purposefully before that can happen. In a pre-industrial world, we start off at the forge. We don't start off in the city or at a factory. We're at a pre-industrial world where things were simpler and clearer and emotionally richer in Dickens's estimation, where the problems are not quite so complex. You can see as Pip gets older, the problems become increasingly complex as the world becomes increasingly widespread. So likeness, which at the time in which Dickens is writing, 1861 the book comes up, likeness is something which can be reproduced mechanically, but in the world Pip is talking about, likeness is reproduced imaginatively. It's the product of fancy. And it is unreasonably derived. It's not logical that we look at reality and come up with this story. It's unreasonable that it's derived from Dickens's experience, Pip's experience of the world. And as you read through the novel, you start to realize that this is the much older Pip writing about his childhood and writing for the purpose of trying to explain himself, to justify himself, to figure out how the hell did I get here? Why did I act that way? So he's looked back on the facts of his life and he's retold the story in a way that fits his imagination, that fits his needs to present himself in a certain way. It's the same thing as when you're sitting at the dinner table next to your sibling, or you're reporting to a group of friends. Two of you have gone somewhere and you're reporting to a group of friends, and you each tell the story of what happened totally differently. You're telling the story in some way to feature the thing which shines best on you. Look at how strong I was in that event. Look how smart I was in making that decision. Look at how funny I was in cracking that joke. And the person next to you tells the story in the way that most benefits him or her. This is a story told in the way that most benefits Pip. It's his imaginative recasting. It's a likeness, not an exact reproduction. So just to give you a sense of what is meant by the days before photography, I give you this very complicated list of dates. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize all of them. The key that I want you to think about here is this date on the bottom. Let me find my mobility ability here. So 1861 right here, this is when the novel comes out. So by the time Great Expectations appears, photography is extremely well established in Great Britain. The early date to look at is 1834, 1837. Henry Fox Talbot, William Henry Fox Talbot, develops the photograph in Great Britain, the negative process that we now know. Louis Daguerre develops the photograph in France, which was not a paper process, but a process which etched the image onto a metal plate. And I've actually brought with me, they're too fragile for me to pass around in this big of a group, but I've brought with me some examples of daguerreotypes. They were metal plates so that were etched by chemicals. So you don't want them to be etched again by accidentally scratching them. So they were always produced in these kinds of beautiful cases. This one is a leather one. This one is, this is embossed leather. This is actually very early 19th century plastic, and it has the photograph inside. So if you want to come and look at it afterwards, you're welcome to come. And I've also brought with me a couple of, to me, very precious, so I will hunt you down and shoot you if you walk out with these. That's on record now. These are two examples of photographs of Dickens. These were actually taken in Dickens's own time with the process that was invented in 1851. These are collodion prints, much cheaper. They would have been photographed in a special camera that prints 8 images on a page on one negative, so they were much cheaper because you were paying basically 1/8 of the price of a regular photograph. And these would have been sold in all sorts of different shops in London and in other cities. Dickens's image was so prolific, so well known, that he felt he could not walk the streets of London without being recognized. It's kind of like there weren't things like People magazine yet, but he became a celebrity through the production of photographs. So even though he sets the novel and theirs were the days before photographs, Dickens's own days were not. He was very much a product of a photographic culture. So these are up here as well. Again, I know who you are. I will chase you down. Matthew Brady, do you recognize that name? He's the Civil War photographer. If you've ever seen a photograph of the Civil War, it was probably taken by Matthew Brady. And he also was the primary photographer of Abraham Lincoln. So what does the reference to photography, even though what Dickens does is he never mentions photographs again in the book. He says, theirs were the days before photographs, and that's the last we hear about it, but it has a benefit to the novel as a whole. It's part of that initial setup. How do I read the rest of this novel? What does the reference do for Dickens? It helps establish a timeline for the novel. And if you do have the Norton Critical Edition, that edition I showed at the beginning, there is an article in the back of that which shows how a literary scholar would try to establish a timeline for the novel. When was Pip born? How old is Pip at any given moment? What are the years between which this novel takes place? I want to warn you against going online to establish that, because Wikipedia and the other sources that are reading Wikipedia have the dates wrong. But the one that's in your book is very scholarly and I think very useful for you. It basically says the novel starts at, Pip is about age 7, and he reaches age 7 somewhere within the first decade of the 19th century. So definitely the decades before photography was invented. Let me say, because I forgot to mention this, if you looked at the beginning of the book and you see the handwritten version from his manuscript that puts the title page, and then he has his dedication. This is partly recognizing Dickens's relationship to photography. He dedicates it to his friend Chauncey Hare Townsend, who was the first private collector of photography in Great Britain. First person to recognize that this is a form that's going to be important enough that having a collection would be worthwhile. He had a weird reason for it. He was into mesmerism, which was like seances. That's how Dickens met him, because Dickens was really interested in it. And Townsend thought that photography was going to be able to show creatures from other worlds. The dead would come back. We could photograph auras, that sort of thing. It was a little weird. But he was a good friend of Dickens. So the mention of photography helps us to establish a timeline for the novel. It also helps to establish the novel functioning in a real world. Much of the novel seems like it exists in some other world where, women stay in their wedding dresses for years and years and years, and, miraculous things happen, miraculous accidents and stuff like that happens. But because it mentions real things like the photograph, we know it's a part of the world that we, the readers, live in as well. This is, for me, the big important part. It contradicts the prevailing idealizing of mechanical reproduction. It's basically Dickens thumbing his nose at photography and all mechanical reproduction and saying that the imaginative mind, as opposed to any kind of mechanical storytelling, mechanical art, the mind, the imagination is far more important than any of these machines of progress that we're involved in. And finally, it places fancy above fact. We know that Pip isn't telling us the absolute truth. He's a kind of unreliable narrator because he's trying to show himself off to be better, not to be blamed, not to be so guilty. He's trying to expiate that guilt as he tells the story. His imagination, his imaginative memory is more important than the facts of the event, even though as he reports those facts, we're able to judge who Pip is by contrasting what he says about the facts and what the facts say to us. But Dickens and Pip are going to privilege fancy above fact. One of the elements in which that becomes really important is the theme that runs through the novel, that appearances can be deceiving. So a good example of this is the fact that Pip can dress like a gentleman even before, and look like a gentleman, even before he's really acquired any of the skills of a gentleman. His appearance makes him seem like a gentleman already. And in contrast, Drummle and Compeyson, if you've met both of these characters, Drummle and Compeyson both look like gentlemen, but they behave not like gentlemen. Drummle is cruel and vicious, and Compeyson is simply a con artist, a kind of evil con artist, but dressed well. And because he's dressed well, he gets a lighter sentence than Magwitch does, the convict does, because the convict isn't dressed well at all. So appearances can be deceiving. Jaggers tells us, Jaggers is the lawyer, for those of you who haven't gotten there. He's the lawyer who helps Miss Havisham, but also helps Pip in the administration of his great expectations. Jaggers says quite famously, take nothing on its looks, take everything on evidence, there is no better rule. Of course, what we find out when we first meet Jaggers, when Pip first gets to London, is that Jaggers is trying to find witnesses who look believable. When Pip first meets Jaggers, Jaggers is trying to find a witness, and I think it's Mike or somebody who brings the witness in, and Jaggers looks at him and says, he doesn't look like he's trustworthy, why are you bringing this guy to me? So appearances are actually important to Jaggers, even though Jaggers says appearances don't count. So we're just going to open this whole thing up again. Okay. The other quotes that I have here, and maybe you can recognize this without without having it in front of you, but do you remember, some of you who have gotten farther through the novel, when Joe goes to visit Pip in London, and Pip is so rude to him, and when Joe is leaving, he says, I'm just not right in these clothes. I may be appearing like I'm in the right place, but I'm not actually right in these clothes at all. So Joe knows that he's not really right in London, even if he dresses well. Magwitch also, when Magwitch comes back, and for those of you who haven't gotten that far, I don't want to completely ruin that for you, but when Magwitch comes back, he also cannot be disguised. Pip tries to dress him in nicer clothes so he won't look like a convict, but he can't be disguised. Those two characters, Joe and Magwitch, are both very true to who they are. So appearances can be deceiving in bad people. In good people, they will always be the good people that they are. Okay, so my thing is not here at all. No. That's not it. Autoplay? Click on autoplay, okay. Thank you so much. What would I do without students knowing how to work these things? Okay, so thank you very much. So we're down, appearances can be deceiving. So these are the two quotes that I was talking about when Joe comes to London and he can't be anything but himself, and when Magwitch comes and also can't be anything but himself. That is, goodness shines through no matter what you're wearing. You are yourself, but evil can be hidden behind appearances. Okay, so let me go. This is just not my system. How do I get my slideshow to start? From current slide. Okay, so rule number 3 we're on now. Rule number 3 is go to the movies in your head. And this is the poster for that 1946 version. I'm going to keep pushing the 1946 version. You can watch it completely online if you go to the WOLM page at the library. Molly has mounted it there. Just click on the link for the film. Wonderful, wonderful film. Not the same as the novel, so don't watch the film instead of reading the book, but a wonderful film that really captures Dickens's novel. What I mean by going to the movies in your head is utilizing Dickens's visual sense. Virginia Woolf said that he had the visualizing power to the extreme. And when you read these novels, you can read them very much as if they are scripts for movies. In fact, my first idea for my dissertation was going to be writing about Dickens in film. And then I found these little weird references to photographs, which led me to write about Dickens in photography. I love her line, his people are branded upon our eyeballs before we hear them speak. It's interesting because it seems as if she's going for the picture, this still picture, but she's actually going for the movie picture. That is, they speak and they act. So here's an example. John Jordan used this example on Monday as well, an example of Dickens being extremely visual. The argument I want to make is that when Dickens is at his most visual, he actually can go so far over the top that it stops being visual and becomes purely imaginative. So this passage is a really good example of that. This is the description, the first appearance of the convict at the opening of the novel. A fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat and with broken shoes, with an old rag tied around his head, a man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lamed by stones and cut by flints and stung by nettles and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. Now, the first couple sentences, you think this is a real description. This seems very accurate, very much just get the picture in your mind. But once we get into this catalog, he'd been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lamed by stone, this long catalog, it stops being real. It starts to get fuzzy. You almost see too much of it to the point that it looks fake. And the fakeness here is to make the convict into something more than a real person. The convict starts to take on fairy tale qualities, fictional qualities. That word briar stuck in my craw. Now what am I supposed to do here? No, okay. It's stuck in my craw because Briar Rose is one of the other names, alternative names for this story of Sleeping Beauty. Remember, she pricks her finger. So early versions of that had her prick her finger on a briar bush, a thorn bush. This is from a 19th century illustrated version of Sleeping Beauty of Briar Rose. But you can see that in the novel, we get a lot of things that become fairy tales, that start off with accurate descriptions, that get pictures in our mind, but then the pictures become so over the top that they read like fairy tales. The convict ultimately gets referred to as looking like a pirate. Miss Havisham gets referred to as looking like, this is an illustration of Miss Havisham from the end of the century, she gets referred to as being like a witch. Where you see Dickens's physical descriptions best, I think, is in the scenery, and this is a beautiful description from the end of the first chapter of the marshlands. The marshes were just a long black horizontal line then. As I stopped to look after him, this is the convict moving away. And the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad, nor yet so black. And the sky was just a row of long, angry red lines and dense black lines intermixed. The image I have here is a still from that David Lean film which I think it just took the book. Open the book, he said, the director, just film what's in here, because it exactly replicates what Dickens's words are saying. But again, Dickens goes overboard, and he starts to analyze what he's looking at until we get to the end, the middle, about just below the center. He sees the gibbets, and he says, when you're near them, the gibbets have some chains hanging to it, which once held a pirate. The man was limping on toward this ladder as if he were the pirate come to life. So now we've left reality and gone into the fairy tale, the fiction here. And that's what happens with Dickens' visual sense. The movie starts running in your mind, and it starts to become less and less about reality. This is the truth we know about movies, because unless that movie is stamped documentary, we know that as real as that image may look to us, gee, they're wearing clothes I might be able to buy at the Gap or something, we know that it's fictionalized. And this is where Dickens is actually experimenting with that idea. You depict reality with such intensity, you move it into unreality. Rule 4. See, we're moving through this. This is my longest rule, so let's make sure we get through it. Connect the dots. What do I mean by that? It's quite simple. When you are reading, especially a long work like this, but any time you're reading, you should always be looking for patterns and repetitions. Patterns and repetitions always yield meaning. There's a reason why we go back to the same story or the same image or the same word. So the pattern that I want to look at, the repetition I want to look at today is the idea of food. And I do this in honor of my English 1A students for whom the primary reading this semester, before we got to Great Expectations, was essays about food. Lots of topics relevant to food today. Food gets introduced to us on basically the second page of the novel when the convict says to Pip, "Do you know what wittles is?" Wittles means victuals, which means food. He's hungry, he's starving. But food appears in the novel in multitudinous ways. And these are just two images, again from the David Lean film. On the left, Pip's meal with Herbert when he first arrives in their housing. And on the right, Pip pushing Miss Havisham around the table that holds Miss Havisham's bridal feast. But I want to start with the idea of, in the dialogue with the convict actually turns Pip into food. He says, "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips at me, "what fat cheeks you got." "Darn me if I couldn't eat 'em," said the man with a threatening shake of his head, "and if I hadn't half a mind to it." And then a page later, "You fail." So you fail, no matter how small it is, and your heart and liver shall be tore out and roasted and ate. So the first food that we encounter in this novel is Pip. And those who have read the rest of the novel know that in some ways Pip is consumed by the convict. I won't tell you how if you haven't gotten that far. Here's tea with Mrs. Joe. That sounds like it's going to be a good event, but look at what Mrs. Joe does. With her left hand, she jammed the loaf hard and fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin in it and sometimes a needle, which we afterwards got in our mouth. This meal reads like Mrs. Joe's relationship to Pip, right? She says she's taking care of him, but she's actually kind of abusing him, even in feeding him. She's rough and tumble. Food carries the meanings of character in it, tells us something about the person cooking, the person serving, the person eating. Pip brings the convict food, and this is a key moment. Pitying his desolation and watching him as he gradually settled down upon the pie, this is the pork pie that he's stolen, I made bold to say, "I'm glad you enjoy it." "Did you speak?" "I said I was glad you enjoyed it." "Thank you, my boy, I do." One wonders how long it's been since this convict has had somebody express that to him about a meal, who's offered in generosity this pork pie, which if you were here at John Jordan's lecture on Monday, John showed how that pie, Pip had to go out of his way to find the pie. All the other food that he gathers for the convict is obviously on the shelf, but Pip has to go to the back of the shelf and inside a container to be able to find the pork pie. It's a very special treat he's brought. But after this moment of what I would call an exchange of humanity, an exchange of gracious behavior, Pip then describes the convict as a dog. I had often watched a large dog of ours eating his food, and now I noticed a decided similarity between the dog's way of eating and the man's. So now, and he repeats the dog all the way through the passage to the very end, in all of which particulars he was very like the dog. So he's already snobby enough, or at least the older Pip looking back at the younger Pip meeting the convict, has the snobbery to say, not that this man is human like me, but this man is like a dog. Maybe he's motivated to do that because he's treated like a dog as well. This is when Estella brings Pip something to eat on his visit to Miss Havisham's. She came back with some bread and meat and a little mug of beer. She put the mug down on the stones of the yard and gave me the bread and meat without looking at me, as insolently as if I were a dog in disgrace. I was so humiliated, hurt, spurned, offended, angry, sorry. I cannot hit upon the right name for the smart. God knows what its name was. The tears started to my eyes. And then he goes on to say he's trying to control the tears. But here is Pip, who has turned on the convict to describe him as being like a dog, himself being treated like a dog and experiencing so intently that he can't quite get the right word for it, experiencing that same humiliation expressed through a moment of eating. Are you starting to see the patterns? The morning of Christmas dinner, this relates very much to how Mrs. Joe is in that earlier scene about the bread. Excuse me. Pip starts, we were to have a superb dinner consisting of a leg of pickled pork and greens and a pair of roasted stuffed fowls. A handsome mince pie had been made yesterday, which accounted for the mincemeat not being missed, and the pudding was already on the boil. Look at how elevated these words are. These extensive arrangements occasioned us to be cut off unceremoniously in respect of breakfast. For I ain't, said Mrs. Joe, I ain't a-gonna have no formal cramming and busting and washing up now with what I've got before me, I promise you. So we had our slices, this is Joe and Pip, we had our slices served out as if we were 2,000 troops on a forced march instead of a man and boy at home, and we took gulps of milk and water with apologetic countenances from a jug on the dresser. So again, we're reinforcing Mrs. Joe's character, the nature of the situation of Pip's childhood, by virtue of describing a meal. Christmas dinner itself, I'm sure if you've read it, you can't forget it. This is when everybody around him is just berating Pip and attacking him on whatever they possibly can, so that he was not allowed to speak. The food for him he feels like he's being devoured by the people around him. He is the meal, because they all get a chance to eat up on him, to put him down. And Joe is there, but Joe can't quite save him. The only thing Joe can do, and this is what the second passage here is about, is that when there's a moment like this, he comforts him by giving him more gravy, and he ends up giving him about half a pint of gravy on his plate. This is Joe being nice. So food becomes the vehicle for character. Probably very famous scene. I'm not going to read it all to you. This is the description at Miss Havisham's of the bridal table with the cake rotting, and there's spiders. I clipped out the part that there's rats running around, mice running around as well. Pretty disgusting. But this table sums up Miss Havisham. She is not eating anything. She won't let anybody see her eat now, but she has that terrible relic of her broken marriage, of her disappointment in love, always on the table as a meal that goes uneaten. There is nothing more unnatural than a meal that goes uneaten. You might remember the first dinner with Herbert if you've gotten to the second part of the book. The second part of the book, when Pip gets to London, He meets Herbert, who's supposed to help him become more gentlemanlike, and he gets excited by the meal. It's the lap of luxury, except the place is so small that all of the different dishes which have been brought in from the coffee house, so it's takeout, all of the different dishes are being kept on top of all of the furniture, so that when he goes to bed at night, he finds much of the parsley and butter on his sheets on his bed. But it's also the scene where Herbert shows us how kind he is, how considerate he is, in the way he instructs Pip in how to be a gentleman, which starts with how to eat properly at the table. It's the revenge of all your mothers who told you to hold the fork and knife properly. This is that moment in literature. There's more food scenes as well. I can't go through all of them. When Pip goes to have dinner at the Pockets, and the Pockets are neglecting their children, or Mrs. Pocket is neglecting her children, and Mr. Pocket says babies are to be nutcracker dead for people's poor grandpapa's positions. He eats dinner at Walworth with Wemmick. That's the warmest, most comforting, most positive scene in all of the food scenes in the novel. He has dinner with Mr. Jaggers, which is a pretty horrific scene. Joe comes for tea in London, and unlike Herbert, who treated the newly arrived Pip with such kindness, Pip treats Joe, again, from the position of being very patronizing and very critical of him. So there's a lot more food in the novel. The theory about connect the dots really is, you have to answer the question, what do I do once I see these patterns? What happens when I see these repetitions? And for me, the basic thing, and I teach this to all my students, is that you have to ask yourself, so what? So what? I see all of these references to food. So what is that going to mean for me? How is that going to better explain the novel for me? So the simple question is, why all the food references? Food is part of the representation of life. If Dickens is writing a novel about this young man and how he grows and matures, it would be natural to find scenes in which people are eating. It's a part of life. Eating is a common activity. We can easily relate to it. Even if we eat different food than they do, we can still relate to it easily. And each food scene carries with it more meaning than what's on the menu, as I said. Food was and still is an indicator of status and class. And we can see that by people eating different things in different places in different ways. There's a great essay if you're interested. It's 1963, so I'm sorry it's not available online, but Barbara Hardy's essay on food and ceremony and Great Expectations, she argues that in part it's a sign of love. Those who get food, those who don't get food, it's an indicator of love in the novel. Very interesting argument, but in the interest of time I won't go into it. I really want to get to the question which I think has been haunting me more than anything else in both the selection of Great Expectations for the WOLM and in encouraging my colleagues and their students to be reading and enjoying the book. It keeps coming up, why read Dickens? And particularly, why choose Great Expectations as a work of literary merit? John Jordan said there were 5 reasons that we continue to read Dickens 200 years after his birth: the comedy, the characters, the storytelling, the social justice issues, and the language. I want to add to that Dickens's novels explore the human psyche and continue to teach us about ourselves. I think the food examples I think are great for saying, maybe I should think about the meals that I sit at and the way I behave there, or the way people behave toward me, or what is being said when my mother or my roommate puts this dish in front of me, that all eating has some sort of greater meaning. I learned that by reading this novel. Dickens's novels also teach us to think. That is, we watch Pip thinking rightly and unrightly. We learn how to think because of it. And then finally, and this has been my goal when I talk about those 4 different keys to reading novels effectively, finally, ultimately, I would say that Dickens's novels teach us how to read. All of the rules of good reading can be exemplified, can be practiced in reading a Dickens novel, making this novel, as well as the body of his work, quite worth reading 200 years, and I hope 2,000 years in the future. Thank you very much. I can take some questions if anybody has questions. I was so thorough, I knocked all the questions out of you. Okay, if you want to see the photographs, you're welcome to come down and look at them. I'm going to watch you like a hawk.